Hello, welcome to another live stream with Discover Magazine, where we're exploring interesting topics in science, health, archaeology, every sort of thing. So this week we've got a really cool one today. My guest is Dr. Chris Damman, a gastroenterologist and an expert on the gut microbiome. We're talking about you and the health within your gut. So without further ado, let's get us started. Dr. Damman, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and what drew you into this field of gut microbiome research?
Yeah, happy to, Dustin. Thanks very much for the invitation to be on the show. It's a pleasure to always chat about the microbiome. That's one of my favorite topics. So I'm a clinical gastroenterologist. I work at the University of Washington. I do procedures. So when it's time, it's actually now 45 instead of 50 for your colonoscopy. I'd be the type of doctor you'd come and see. But my life's passion has been actually around the little microbes that live within our gut and how they're connected to almost every aspect of our health, almost like a forgotten organ, and that's your gut microbiome. Fascination I can trace all the way back to med school in a really pivotal lecture that we had on how microbes are connected to a lot more of the diseases that we experience, not just infectious diseases, but chronic diseases. And it was with that introduction that I've been following the wave ever since.
Awesome. So let's get into some interesting questions here. Why don't you tell our viewers what exactly is the gut microbiome and why is it so crucial for our overall health?
Yeah, happy to. So the gut microbiome is the collection of microbes that live within our gut. And our gut includes everything from the esophagus to the stomach to the small intestine and large intestine. Generally, when people talk about the microbiome, they're talking about the stool microbiome because that's what's been studied most. And that's the collection of all the bacteria and fungi, and in some cases, even parasites that live within our gut. Super important for health because not only are they helping with digestion and breaking some of the undigestible food components, the leftovers, so to speak, that make it down to the colon and provide our body with really important factors for health. But they also play a really important role in protecting us from pathogens, from invaders. It's kind of our forgotten organ, or one might say our forgotten allies in health that exist within our gut.
So when you said the stool microbiome, is that your fecal matter essentially, or is that stool in that term? Is that a broader kind of term for something beyond what the layman might associate it with?
We're talking delicately about poop, essentially.
Yes.
Yes, it's just a fancy word, more sort of clinical flavor of your average garden variety poop.
Okay. All right. So next question. So how does our gut microbiome specifically affect our digestive health?
Perfect. So alluded to the leftovers in the food that we eat. So most of the nutrients in the food, say when you have a taco, pizza, or perhaps something healthier like a stir fry or a soup, most of that gets absorbed, but there are leftovers, and those leftovers are largely fiber, which give the food its structure, and also other things like phytonutrients or polyphenols. And those filter all the way down to the colon, where our microbes in a healthy state have a feast on those microbes. And what they produce from that leftover matter, largely from the fiber, is absolutely critical for colonic health, the health of our colon. In fact, the colon more or less eats and thrives on one of the byproducts of those bacteria, and that's butyrate. So butyrate is the fuel for our colons. It is what allows all of the cells lining our colon to thrive and to survive.
Okay. So something I feel like terms that are commonly used around the topic of microbiomes and gut health are prebiotics and probiotics. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between them and what role they both play in maintaining gut health and where they how we consume them and things like that?
Absolutely, and I not to confuse matters too much. There's also postbiotics and symbiotics, but let's stick with prebiotics and probiotics initially. So probiotics are largely live organisms that have been shown to have an impact on health outcomes that are used to support gut health and other aspects of health. Um, there are tons of different commercially available probiotics, and they're not highly regulated. So what's advertised on those bottles isn't always actually what you get. So if you're doing probiotics, it's usually a good idea to talk with a health professional and get their recommendation on what probiotic might be useful, and to use them for specific conditions, not just for general gut health. Um, so those are the live organisms that we can consume. In addition to that, there are prebiotics, and prebiotics, it's in some ways kind of a fancy word for fiber. It's just fiber that our gut microbiome likes to eat. And so there's different types of prebiotics, different types of fiber, everything from, inulin, which is present in a lot of processed foods and can be a little bit of a double-edged sword, to fructooligosaccharides, galactooligosaccharides, otherwise known as FOS and GOS, things like resistant starch. There's lots of different classes of prebiotic fibers that help support a healthy microbiome. So they can contribute to the health of your body. And prebiotics in their natural form are actually just natural components of the foods that we eat.
Okay. What about a brief overview of the other two that you mentioned as well?
Sure. So symbiotic is a combination of different biotics, often pre and probiotics together. And you can imagine that can be a powerful combination if you give the food that probiotic likes to eat at the same time. It helps support its thriving. And then a postbiotic, you could think of that, to use a non-delicate term, bacterial poop. And
Okay.
it's essentially the products that they're making, a fancy word for it is the metabolites that they're making from the prebiotics and that are important for our health, things like butyrate.
Okay. What are some of the best dietary sources of prebiotics and probiotics? One of them, correct me if I'm wrong, is I would say I'm dating myself, but I'm not that old. The yogurt commercials with Jamie Lee Curtis, like which one does that fall under?
Was that Activia? I can't
I
remember.
think that's probably Activia. Yeah, I couldn't remember the brand name.
Yeah. So, yogurts and fermented foods are generally a great source of live organisms that have naturally been present in our foods since the beginning of human history, really, because foods would inadvertently ferment, fruits hanging on the tree, or porridges that were stored without refrigeration. So this was a natural part of our evolution. We evolved lock and step with the microbes that are associated with food, and that inadvertently we're fermenting it. And a lot of the probiotics that are available commercially are actually food-derived probiotics.
Okay.
If somebody asks me, should I take a probiotic generally and not for a specific medical condition, I often say, well, you could. Probably isn't going to do harm, but another powerful way of doing that would be to consume fermented foods. Good sources of prebiotics, the best source is natural whole foods. And prebiotics largely are found in plant-based foods. So that would be seeds and nuts and beans, fruits, vegetables, and whole grains like oatmeal and whole grain pastas, etc., whole grain breads. These are all the best sources of prebiotics. These are the things that when you go to the doctor, what's recommended anyway. And this is part of the reason that these things are so healthy for us, is they are feeding our partners in health, the gut microbiome that's making all these important factors for us.
Okay. Going back to probiotics really quickly. So just so I'm understanding this clearly, essentially eating a yogurt or any other sort of fermented food that you might get at the grocery store or at your farmer's market or something, is essentially eating probiotics or consuming probiotics. But in addition to that, there's more, shall we say, deliberate, in ways to ingest by like buying a product that is specifically intended, marketed as a probiotic consumption. And in that instance, it may be, to your point, it's probably not going to hurt you, but if you're going to go down that path, it's best to consult your doctor and make sure that it makes sense for you and that they might have perspective on what you should take versus something else.
That's absolutely right. That's well put. And there's sort of technical definitions of what a probiotic that have been developed at this point. And a fermented food technically does not fall under that definition,
Okay.
because a fermented food, generally speaking, has not been studied to be associated with health outcomes. That said, fermented foods are a great source of live organisms that, in some contexts, have been shown to be helpful.
Okay, so it's like maybe not as concentrated, or just certainly not as regimented in understanding what impact it might have on your gut health and your microbiome and your
That's
overall health. Okay. Shifting to another biotic, let's talk about how antibiotics impact the gut microbiome, and based on that impact, what an individual might be able to do to mitigate some of those effects.
Yeah. Well, generally speaking, our gut microbiomes are incredibly resilient, and a single course of, a defined length of time of an antibiotic, especially when it's recommended by your doctor, is absolutely fine and important and critical. The microbes, have been shown to maybe decrease a little bit, but there are parts within the colon, and actually it turns out maybe one of those parts is the appendix. So appendix does have some function, but certainly not the only place where those microbes will hang out and then basically repopulate the gut. It also happens after something like a colon prep before a colonoscopy. It's more chronic use of antibiotics, prolonged use, and not all antibiotics are the same. Some are more broad spectrum than others that can have impacts on the gut microbiome. So what can people do to help mitigate against the effects of antibiotics? And there have been some studies looking at taking certain probiotics. So this would be maybe one indication where a probiotic could be useful if recommended by your doctor in preventing things like Clostridium difficile infection. But generally speaking, if you're just on a quick course of antibiotics, I usually tell people just have some yogurt, have some kimchi or kefir or sauerkraut, and just generally eat high fiber foods, which will help refeed those microbes and repopulate them after the antibiotic course is finished.
Okay. Before we jump into the next question, I just want to let everybody watching know that if you have any questions for yourself, obviously not your individual situation, but general questions for Dr. Damman, leave them in the comments and we'll try to get to some of them at the end of our pre-planned questions here. So you talked about fiber just a second ago, a couple times actually. So what role does fiber play in maintaining a healthy gut microbiome, and how does fiber from whole foods differ from getting it directly from a supplement that's a fiber supplement?
Yeah, well put. And fiber is the food for our microbes, one of the most important foods for our microbes in our gut. So it plays a disproportional role in supporting a healthy microbiome. Certainly not the only thing. So things like even exercise and good mental health through the gut-brain connection have been shown to be actually really important for a healthy gut microbiome as well. But food is a great place to start, and fiber is one of the most critical pieces of food that supports a healthy gut microbiome. And you ask, well, what about fiber versus whole foods? Whole foods are always the best way to go because whole foods provide a diversity of fibers, even within a single food. And of course, if you're eating a diversity of foods, that provides diversity of fibers twofold. And if there's one thing that our gut microbiome likes, it's diversity. It's a very diverse group of microorganisms itself, and diversity is, at least in the context of the adult gut, something that's been associated with health. So, is there a role for taking a prebiotic fiber? I'm a pragmatist, recognize that eating a whole food based diet, largely plant based, is, quite frankly, difficult and our lives are super busy. And meeting the recommended daily fiber intake of upwards of 30 grams, plus or minus, depending on age and sex, is pretty difficult. I would definitely shoot for doing that all with whole foods, but filling in the gaps with a fiber supplement can be useful. And taking a fiber supplement that has a diversity of fibers might be a really nice way to go. And there's plenty that's available out there.
Okay. So bridging from something you kind of talked a little bit about the other, not external factors, but other maybe non-direct factors in our whole body health. How can other lifestyle factors like stress and sleep influence the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so I love this question. Of course, our minds immediately jump to food, but I refer to the four M's of lifestyle factors that impacts our gut and microbiome. So there's molecules, microbes, movement, and mind. Now, what are those? It's just kind of a rebranding of what you've probably already heard, which is food, exercise slash sleep, and mindfulness, and then adding to that the importance of having microbes in life, not just within our gut, but going out into our gardens, for example, and even foods that are organic have been shown to have higher healthy microbial content within them. So all of these things, the molecules, the microbes, the movement of minds, are actually have been shown in studies to impact our gut microbiome, and the reverse is true too. So this is a two-way road. Our gut microbiome influences our mental state, how well we sleep. Actually, there's studies showing that there are associations between certain gut microbes, those that actually metabolize lactic acid, and athletic performance. So really, really fascinating. Thinking about, people have talked about these gut brain axes, or gut whatever organ of your liking axes, but really it's this sort of highly interconnected web that connects our gut to the rest of our body and to our lifestyle, and vice versa.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy when you think about how much our brain does with our whole body, and how everything kind of is connected, even if it doesn't seem like it should be or would be. And I feel like, as I've done research on this and prepping for this interview, that consideration of how much external factors in your life can impact your gut. I mean, I guess it makes sense when I think about, if I get really nervous, sometimes I'll get a stomach ache. Like, that's maybe like a oversimplifying way to think of it. But if that's the case, then of course, all these other aspects of how I live and what I do will have an impact, and vice versa as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The butterflies in your stomach, or if you don't sleep well, you can notice a change in your bowel habits afterwards in the morning as well.
Yeah. So how important is the diversity of the gut microbiome, and what does that mean exactly, diversity of the microbiome? Is it, are there tens of thousands, millions of different microbes, different, obviously there's many, but are there different types of them? And what can individuals do to promote a more diverse and healthy microbiome?
Yeah, so within our gut, there's tens of trillions of individual microbes, but I think what you're asking is how many strains there are, different distinct types of microbes. And it really depends on who you ask and how deep you sequence, and where you how you establish the cutoff and what is distinct, right? Because even just a single mutation you could classify as a distinct microbe, and microbes evolve very rapidly. But generally speaking, most experts would say maybe on the order of 1,000 to 2,000 different types of microbes within the gut, plus or minus. And that's pretty incredible when you think about it. You compare that to other ecosystems, say the forest around the corner from your house, or the park even, if you live in an urban setting. The level of diversity that's in this tiny little organ within our gut, in terms of microbes, is approaching that of an ecosystem in a park or a forest. So is this important? Is diversity important for health? And studies show that within the gut, in the adult gut specifically, that the more diverse your gut microbiome, generally speaking, that does associate with health. Now, there's exceptions to that. There's exceptions in other microbiomes as well. So, for example, the infant gut microbiome is very different. And there, it's largely bifidobacterium predominant in health. And the reason really has to do with what an infant is consuming versus what an adult is consuming. An infant is more or less consuming milk, and mother's milk, or in some cases formula, and hence the microbiome reflects the diversity or lack thereof in the diet. But a healthy individual should be having a very diverse diet, and the microbiome reflects that as well.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about how different external or internal external factors like your mental health and sleeping and things like that, sleep patterns, can impact your gut microbiome. But is there any kind of idiosyncrasies to how your microbiome can influence those other things going the other direction? So if you have an unhealthy microbiome, can it damage your immune system? Can it impact your mental health and sleep patterns that way? Or is it more of a one-way street kind of thing?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked this question, because as we research the microbiome, we're recognizing it's really connected to all aspects of health. And you can almost think of it like the heart. The heart pumps blood to every part of the body. The heart stops working, and the body in general stops working. It's maybe not that severe in the absence of a gut microbiome, but nonetheless, there are molecular pathways, there are neurological pathways, and there are immunological pathways that connect the gut to all the other parts of our body. So I like this list that you provided, because it really hits all of those key areas. And just to provide an example of each, in terms of immune health, the microbiome, I keep mentioning this molecule butyrate. It's super important for lots of aspects of health. And it just so happens that butyrate regulates our immune cells. And it, in some ways, dampens the immune response. So there are some studies associating the gut microbiome with autoimmune disease. And this may be one of the ways by which generally the gut helps protect our immune system from overzealous responses to otherwise healthy commensal organisms through butyrate. So yes, definitely impacts the immune system. There's other studies showing associations between the microbiome and, say, viral infections like the flu. But metabolic health, huge. Butyrate actually features prominently in this story as well. It regulates directly mitochondria and helps promote healthy mitochondria, which many will recognize as the furnaces of the cells that actually convert energy into usable energy. So it takes things like carbohydrates and fats and turns them into ATP for the cell. But there's also strong connections between butyrate and GLP-1. And GLP-1 we've heard a lot about recently in the press. around new drugs for weight loss and for blood sugar control. So GLP-1 is present naturally in the gut as well, and it's stimulated by butyrate. And the butyrate is made by the gut microbiome. And then mental health, there are actually, in addition to these sort of molecular and cellular pathways that connect the gut to the brain, there's an actual nerve, and it's an information highway that goes in both directions called the vagus nerve. What happens in the vagus doesn't stay in the vagus. In this case, it actually goes all over the body. It's vagus, actually, in Latin, I believe, is wandering. So it's the wandering nerve, which means it wanders everywhere. And so there's other studies that have shown association between the gut microbiome and how well we sleep, or our mental states, anxiety and depression.
Lots of connections there. So before we jump into our closing questions here, I want to ask you something that wasn't on our pre-planned list and isn't an audience question, but since we did broach the topic of poop earlier, can you talk a little bit about like what a fecal transplant is and how those, without going into too much detail, like why you would do that, why it's beneficial in certain circumstances? Because I think that's it's something that I've heard about when it comes to this topic, and I think it's kind of gross out, but it's also just so fascinating to me, and really speaks to the importance of a healthy gut microbiome, and the fact that something that we culturally, I don't even culturally, it just is like poop is gross, like in general, but like something that is so gross can actually be so healthy and beneficial in that weird kind of instance.
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying these are still very much frontier days in microbiome therapies, and these somewhat gross and crude approaches to treatments using stool is really just an initial foray into the field. And there's companies that have already developed more sophisticated approaches with defined collections of microbes that are actually commercially available now for treating Clostridium difficile infection. And this is where ultimately this field will probably move, is away from clinical fecal transplants, which always should be done in the context of medical supervision. You'll see YouTube videos and things and how-tos, and that's definitely not recommended.
Yeah, no. Yes, I can. That seems like a dangerous place to play in.
Absolutely. But, I'm in addition to a firm believer in the value of rigorous research, also actually put a lot of stock in tradition and time-honored approaches to healing, as well as to nutrition. And what's super interesting, if you look in the historical annals of medicine, say Chinese herbal medicine, there was this curious treatment that was used called yellow soup. You can only imagine what that yellow soup was. Many, many years ago, fecal transplants were already being used. And actually, another example would be Bedouins and dysentery and using camel dung in order to treat that. Again, don't recommend this at home. But yeah, I think these are broad brushstroke frontier approaches to treatment. And we already are starting to have more sophisticated approaches to treating disease using these refined, defined microbial combinations.
Okay, very cool. So that's a good bridge to our second to last question here, which is, what are some of the most exciting developments beyond what you just touched on in gut microbiome research, and how do you think they might shape our future health recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I allude to frontier days, and we started out talking about poop, and poop is really an early first target for studying the microbiome. But very recently, we've developed new approaches for understanding the small intestine microbiome, which is really the epicenter of digestion, and of immunity. And it's been a really hard to reach area historically, requiring, sedating medications and invasive procedures like upper endoscopies to get to. But there are new approaches that use minimally invasive capsules or tethered capsules that don't require sedation that are allowing us to reach these frontiers within our gut. And I do think that the small intestine will provides great insights and new approaches to treating disease. So I'm super excited about that. Actually, this is a hot topic because it's an article that I just wrote, and you can find available as early as next week. If you just search small intestine and maybe my last name, it would come up. One other area that I'm super excited about is understanding better how food and microbes come together and how we can use just natural foods to support a healthy microbiome. And I've basically scoured the scientific literature and compiled that within my brain and created this pretty simple tool that allows you to pick some of the better foods for your gut microbiome. And it's basically just an online calculator. You type in a food and then it will give you a 1 to 100 ranking of that food. And it's driven by relationships between nutrients. So for example, your carb to fiber ratio, fiber being a really important food for your microbiome that's often missing in processed foods. But other ratios too inform this 1 to 100 scale. So really excited about how that could empower every individual. There's actually what I hope to be a freely available app that should be coming out as well that will have the algorithm. And you can just scan any food, the UPC code, and it'll tell you, oh, where does it fall in a 1 to 100? And then you could even take those individual foods, create recipes, and it'll give you a score of that recipe or of your overall diet or, of your shopping list. And then that could be used as a guide for how you might be able to improve your diet. So yeah, it empowers people at the level of, do I eat this food or that food? Do I make that recipe or this recipe, or how could I change it to make it healthier?
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's at your website, which is gutbites.org, correct?
That's correct. Yep.
I have a little banner here to share to wrap up. Is there anything else you want to touch on that you're working on or projects that you have coming up? I know you talked about your site here, which is at the bottom of the screen. And I played around with the calculator a little bit yesterday, and it was kind of cool to see how cool and a little surprising for some things of where they kind of ranked, but it's a really neat tool. Anything else you want to cover before we say goodbye here today?
No, I mean, this has been wonderful. I always like talking about the microbiome. My wife and 3 daughters, young daughters, will attest to that. And we have an unusual dinner table.
I was just thinking that
is not something that we keep in the bathroom all the time, but yeah, equally passionate about how these themes are important for child health, women's health. And these were big themes when I worked at the Gates Foundation and continue to percolate through my work right now. And I have pet projects like a children's series that in very intuitive and easy ways through storytelling help kids understand the importance of our gut microbiome and how all these different environmental factors influence it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Damman. We really appreciate your time today. I hope this was super interesting for our audience as it was for me. And yeah, thanks again. Have a great day, everyone.